to be announcing amazing food system co-conspirator to deep system tweaking, sort of relational, uh, just I don't even know how to describe your function of the food system. If we're looking at like if let's talk it from an ecological sense, just like a forest spirit that's just flying around pollinating these things. Deepa has been a huge role model in a lot of ways, an icon for me in the food system. And I'm so happy to have to invite Deepa in and share the amazing work that Deepa has been doing. And yeah, I'm just gonna pass it over to you. Yeah, love you.
There we go. Oh, that's so funny. You're like the ultimate hype person in so many places that I'm in, which is amazing. And I know it's funny because I think I tell everyone that you're my food systems Gandalf mentor person. So it's kind of funny that we say that about each other, which I love. Thank you so much, Guy and Toad, for inviting me to be here. I like to start by acknowledging that I'm on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation in Naarm. Yeah, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodianship of the elders, past, present, and emerging of our land and our waterways. I'm just down the way from the Maribyrnong River here, significant site of kind of nourishment as well. And I would like to acknowledge that when we talk about food, and I often think about this being someone in the nutrition space, that First Nations people have been thinking about this for a long, long time, and the colonial forces that have extracted from that knowledge as well. So thank you for letting me be here. I haven't been able to be here for the whole session, but I got to hear a bit of Rash's presentation, and Rash is also someone that I've learned a lot from in my previous role. We got to work together, and I've always admired Rash's courage and perseverance in this space, and also her immense knowledge around nutrition and nourishment as well. So I've learned a lot from her. So I feel very welcomed in this space, which is really, really nice. I am going to spend a bit of time just talking about some things that I have learned along the way in food land. And I think Guy will probably go into like a bit of a discussion of the whole kind of session afterwards, which I'm really excited to hear from others about what they've kind of learned from the other parts of this session as well. And I guess how it fits into permaculture for me is that I actually am not the best at growing food. So I'm sorry, I feel like a bit of an imposter being here, but not the best gardener or the permaculturalist. But I come from that kind of nutrition, that and the other end of the spectrum. But I think they're all super interlinked. The way that we grow, the way we care for our land, and the food that we eat are essentially very political, but they're often told to us that they're not political, that it's objective. And then people like us feel gaslit by that whole system. So I think it's really important to have these conversations. My background is as a dietitian. I studied to be a dietitian because I love food deeply. Sri Lankan Tamil by background, spent years growing up in Singapore as well, and food's just like I'm sure it is for many of you. So part of my identity, it's the thing that brings me joy. It's what I think about when I wake up in the morning, and I think about what am I going to eat next at every meal. Um, but it's this source of deep comfort, and I think the reason I became a dietitian was because of that. But some of the things that I've had to learn and unlearn in that process of that professional world have taught me a few things that, yeah, I just like to share. And maybe I'm sharing things that you already know, but some of the things that I've learned along the way. So one of the first things that I thought I'd share, which kind of made sense to me later on after leave, the kind of not being so closely linked with the profession, is kind of when we I think colonial ways of seeing things are about kind of ranking what is good and what's not good, or ranking what's the best of something. And in the nutrition land, I don't know if you've heard this, that often what is called the Mediterranean diet is seen as the gold standard of healthy eating, which is quite hilarious, really, because it doesn't make much sense at all. Because basically, when they mean the Mediterranean diet, they mean the white passing parts of the Mediterranean are the healthiest diets. And that actually has stemmed from this study that this white man did, where he compared seven different countries, mainly in the global north, that and compared what people's medical situations were. So this was in the 50s, where there was like this really big obsession with low fat diets being the thing that would make us all really healthy. And so when he compared all these diets and how people's, cholesterol levels were and those sorts of things, he found that people in Greece and Italy had like the lower levels of cholesterol. But he didn't really look at anything else other than that. He just looked at that one marker. And also quite interestingly was that he actually there's been reports of that he did this study during the period of Lent in Greece. So people were potentially actually fasting during that time. So that's maybe why their dietary markers were so different for everyone else. Um, and so there was this kind of like, oh, there's something in these like Greek Italian diets that are of interest. And that also is about how that has translated then to Western countries being like these powerhouses of kind of determining what is good for us and what's not. Largely we tend to look to the US and the UK for that. And so in the US, what you saw was this migration, of course, of Italian people over to the US, but also a group of migrants who had more ability to gain resources, to gain land, and to kind of be able to pitch themselves as a cultural pillar within society compared to other migrants from African backgrounds, or even obviously the First Nations people. These people were centered as having a better diet. So it's quite, I found it quite interesting that that has happened, and it actually is still something that is incredibly pervasive in our society and nutrition language. It is still seen, there's still heaps of books that are written about the Mediterranean diet being the healthiest diet. But interestingly, if you look at the people that like govern that, or the communities that are part of that, it's actually only like 2 countries that actually cover the Mediterranean. All the different African nations and Middle Eastern nations aren't put into place. So largely, I would say it's a racist construct. So I find that really, really interesting, but also it's something that I think about in the way that we kind of are the biases that we have in our practice as people who work in the nutrition space. There's also been very little kind of focus or studies that have been done about the benefits of various other diets. Like we all know in every single culture, every diet, every part of our culture has things that are better for us and things that are not so great for us. No, I think it's a very broad and misleading statement to say that one particular cultural diet is better. They're so diverse, and how do you even like put them into a box? And I do think that colonial ways of being are about conformism and forcing us to look at things in a very black or white way. So that's one of the things that I just wanted to put out there is, what we say when we mean nourishment. This has also then flowed into things like what we say in government world about what is healthy and what is not healthy. If you look at things like the Australian Dietary Guidelines or various other country guidelines, they are largely centered on a Western diet. And that can be quite problematic in my experience when I've worked in the nutrition space. There's often a push where you'd be talking to a migrant community, you'd be talking to Indian, African migrants, and you're telling them that they have to eat basically a salad to be healthy. And we all know that our grandmothers, our African, Indian, our Asian grandmothers, they know what is good for you. And you're trying to basically, I think, to me, what I have seen that do, it's like you try and deconstruct cultural knowledge and cultural wisdom, and you try and put Western ideas as a higher value. I unfortunately, as a dietitian, when I started off my dietetics degree, I definitely internalized this, and there was a lot I had to unlearn. So when I first studied dietetics, because I was getting told this thing of like good food is Western food, is healthy salads, I went home to my mum and I was like, I don't want to eat any of your curries, which is awful because I actually thought that I was unhealthy. But now when I understand that food, that love, that care, the spices and herbs that all make up the food that she cooked for me, I know that that's incredibly nourishing. And I do think that Western ways of being force us to kind of distrust our own bodies and our own communities and their language as well. So it's taken a long time of kind of unlearning those ways of seeing the world and food. But I'm definitely someone who has unlearned that. And I think when the Western world finds a focus or an interest in something that mainly that they can capitalize on, if you think about, no one really cared about turmeric in people's like what they were eating. All of us in South Asia would have turmeric in like every meal in our curries, and then suddenly some probably some traveler, some tourist who's come to find themselves, finds turmeric and then wants to do a bunch of research on this. And then it becomes a thing that we put turmeric in lattes, which is quite wild, I would say. I think my grandma would find it quite disgusting that we do that. But I think it's quite interesting that like how these things come to be and how they come to be in our psyche, our social norms, and how do we untangle them and interrogate them as well. And that brings me to certain, like the profession of nutrition, the profession of dietetics. And this is actually some really interesting work that a colleague of mine, a friend of mine who is doing at La Trobe University, who's actually looking at she wrote this great paper about the origins of the dietetics profession. And largely that stems from the kind of home economics, the housewife, the housewife in post-World War who was, organizing their lives for their families and, reading different cookbooks, started to move into the space of wanting to understand nutrition and deem what was healthy. And I'd love to read a little like section for you of a paragraph that was written in this paper, because I just found it really, really interesting. So early dietitians are characterized as white, native-born Protestant middle-class women, or typically middle-class and white women. The early establishment of the profession during World War One, these dietitians were struggling for distinct status and power within and in relation to female health and medical occupation. So they were trying to kind of set themselves apart and make themselves validated in a very male profession, being medicine. And so they relied upon the exclusion and subordination of ethnic women and women of color to maintain their position, signifying that while early dietitians were marginalized in the military health workforce by virtue of their sex, they also participated in the subordination of other women through knowledge and science. The construction of dietary taxonomies, body weight investigations, racial ethnic food classifications, and even religious and regionally based food studies, dietitians set themselves in the banquet of the medical profession. Therefore, we propose that the emancipatory potential of a dietitics career for women was exclusively for white middle-class women, which reinforced both by broader social expectation and internal professional self-protection. I found that, to me, as someone who's been in this workforce and been part of this sector, like reading that was like incredibly eye-opening for me, because it just made everything make so much sense. The idea of holding power and not wanting to be able to put yourself up against a white man who might be a doctor working in a clinical setting means that you have to make other people smaller, and often that being people of color. I found really interesting, and I think often these professions can sometimes attract a certain type of person who is very kind of sees the world in one way and struggles with the grey as well. So I've found solace in these spaces in new forms of the profession that have formed, including one that is about critical dietetics, which looks at that food is more than the mere sum of its nutrients. And I think that's a really important thing, that when we break food down into these like micro or macronutrients and we don't see it fully, then we tend to find simplistic solutions to really complex problems. And, dietitians, nutritionists before hadn't really even been talking about the impact of climate change and food and that interconnection, because we were so focused on these like macro micronutrients in our body and centering the human self rather than being part of nature and the ecological environment around us. And we know that this is incredibly true when it comes to the nutrition and the profession and the way that we talk about body and bodies as well. Centering thin, slim white women, which is what you see definitely across the sector that I work in, it is not very inclusive at all. So I think these like colonial structures that have formed, that have guided certain professions in certain ways of being, need to be entwined and interrogated if we're going to move forward. And the other thing that I love to talk about, I guess, also is the fact that as a result of colonial movements where people have been essentially been taken away, obviously, as you've probably heard in other sessions about land being taken away and cultural wisdom being taken away and Indigenous wisdom being devalued and multicultural wisdom of places that have been colonized being undervalued. it means that a lot of countries and cultures have now centered on or taken pride in um, kind of the corporatized food system. And so even talking to, I was just in Delhi last week with a bunch of food systems actors from the global south, and their conversations are that, the informal market that you would have had in many of these countries and cities where people were growing food in small scale farming and then bringing in, people devalue that and they see the corporatized, the big supermarket coming in as like, yes, we've achieved something, we're moving towards something, there's this economic progress. And to me, that is another form of colonial action that, and the way that a lot of these actors and these corporatized actors are targeting the global south as well in their action, because they're trying to use their kind of power to influence there as well. And I think that's incredibly sad. It's so sad to see that these really small scale informal ways of food sharing that doesn't have to be going through massive regulation and corporatized food system, the corporatized food system is being lost. And that is, we know that that's from the Western influence. The traditional knowledge and wisdom has been disrupted. So then the thing that takes its place is something that is Western and corporatized as well. Um, And some of the really scary and upsetting impacts of that are the health impacts that are happening for communities in the global south, but also we know that happens for multicultural and First Nations communities who are bearing the brunt of kind of non-communicable diseases, being heart disease, diabetes, and those sorts of things. The way that the food system kind of plays out is incredibly unfair in many, many ways. So just as an example, if we think about um, the different food environments, if you were, so for me, living in Melbourne, if you're in somewhere like Fitzroy, but then if you go out to somewhere like Craigieburn, which is the outer suburbs, we know that it's so much harder to find nourishing food in those areas that are in the outer suburbs of our cities, which is ironic because you literally live near farmland. But we know it, the way that food moves around our city, it's often getting sent to some big distribution center and not to the communities around it. And so that kind of injustice is incredibly frustrating, obviously. And often these communities are already struggling with so many other layers of being able to nourish themselves, that putting this other burden of you have to go past like 20 fast food outlets because before you can find a grocer, it's incredibly unfair. And then you put the additional layer of the lack of culturally appropriate food in these communities. So we know that many people who live in these areas will have to travel quite far away to get food that is meaningful to them. There's very little access, and there's very little support to actually find those foods. And the international aisle of the supermarket is not really where you find those foods. But also often in those international aisles in the supermarkets, the food is often not going, or the profits aren't often going to communities themselves or the multicultural communities themselves. This economic leakage that happens into shareholders in the global north, or so I think that is also an element of colonial action that is kind of that keeps playing out for people, migrant communities who leave their countries to come to Australia and our cities are facing that constantly. The thing that kind of, I guess, gives me hope in all of this is that there are really great people doing amazing work in this. And I just wanted to kind of round out my little talk fest by calling out some of those people. And I know that, so Guy and I have had the privilege of working with a wonderful group in Mildura called Food Next Door, who are trying to address some of the really difficult conversations around land access. So I can post links and stuff in the chat for people to look at the work of our friends at Food Next Door. But many of migrants who are coming to work in Australia from communities in Africa who are agricultural, have an agricultural permaculture background themselves, but they have to come and work in the kind of broader food system, whether they're working on like apple orchards and those sorts of things, but have incredible knowledge around growing food that is not really utilized or wanted in that sector. And so Food Next Door have done an incredible job where they basically sign MOUs with landowners who aren't using their land in Mildura, and allow for communities and families to have their own plots where they can grow food in the way that they want. There's wonderful sharing that happens there, people sharing knowledge, sharing food. They have little parties every time. It's just wholesome beautifulness. I mean, it doesn't solve the broader systemic issues that we have in our food system, but you can see that there's these innovations and these ways that communities are moving through the constraints, the colonial constraints of land ownership, for one, in this space to allow for them to access that. And I think for some of the other work that I haven't had the pleasure of being part of, but I've looked to is the Victorian Bush Foods and Botanical Strategy, which is an incredible strategy. I don't know if it's already been discussed, but seeking to look at what could it look like for things like certification, so that we actually know that bush foods profits are going back into communities, Aboriginal and First Nations communities, because we know it's like 1% to 2% at the moment, which is not acceptable. And also some great work that's happening out of Deakin University with the Murnong Research Mob, who are looking at the impact of how we can minimise the impact of the commercial determinants of health on Aboriginal communities, has been incredible. I will probably stop talking there. I really am really interested to hear what other people, what sits with other people, what kind of food nourishes you, and how have you had to kind of fight the colonial systems at play to be able to nourish themselves? Because I think any form of not conforming to the corporatized food system is an act of food justice or food resistance as well.
Thanks, Deepa. So yeah, actively, we on the webinar function here, we can field responses through the Q&A. So we'll get people to ask questions there. We have had an idea about maybe migrating over into Zoom to have a full discussion. But while that is being figured out, I just want to frame, in listening to this, when we the reason why we value permaculture and the movement so much, despite all of the limitations that we've spoken about this, is, it's really helped identify the political nature of where these movements that are focused on in community, grassroots, localized food ownership, food distribution, food sharing, food structuring, and how can we relocate that in a space that fits in with this, maybe not fits in, but helps to inform this larger oppressive system that our governmental food system tries to project onto the communities, and also listening to the limitations that we spoke about when listening to Rasha and listening to Jessica, and it's from both ends, and I think realizing what power these grassroots, place-based, community-oriented food solutions are is really the pathway forward. And I think was so evident in the Food Hubs program and in every other program that we participate in. When it's led by community, we get those real solutions. But I'll pass to you, Toad.
Thank you so much, Deepa. And I think you really hit something really, really huge here, because the underlying thing of more this is so relevant to permaculture as well, because permaculture doesn't talk about wider food systems. It often only talks about individualist food systems, because it's often a very white movement. It doesn't talk about the kind of I find that often in a lot of the very white permaculture spaces, there's the skills to be able to do the cross work and the shared and the community work aren't always as prevalent. There's somewhat, it's just different space, but I'm tangenting here. The framing of this question is I studied nutrition as well to some, in university. And you're talking about the colonial history of food and food systems. I wanted to hear your perspective on how that intersects with current wellness movements, which is a big thing to speak about if you feel happy to open the can off that worms.
Of course, very happy to. I think that plays out in many ways, in ways that kind of, and a side note is that I'm also kind of going through my own kind of like cultural journey of learning yoga and connecting to like Hindu and, you know, decolonial philosophy in that. And I think that's where these two worlds really come together, because you see that so much in that like yoga wellness space. Um, I think where that comes into play is this. Um, well, I think there's almost like a gaslighting of people when we say that, you know, you have the choice to eat healthy, to do these things, to be able to put, you know, you when we see people on social media that have like this beautiful salad that they're eating or whatever, I think there's a gaslighting of telling people that no, you can do that. And the system is not working against you. Well, and it really is. The system is 100% working against you to do that. It's making it hard for you to be able to nourish yourself. The government does not really help with that. They don't really, if the government really did care about those things, we would have policies that would support farmers to grow food well, and for that food to be reaching low income communities rather than them having to rely on things like food banks, which are band-aids to this issue. So to me, the main way that plays out is in a gaslighting, but I think also it is in a telling you that someone else knows better than you what you need for your body as well. And I think that wellness industry, the yoga industry in that sense as well, and from what I've been talking about with the nutrition industry, it's saying that no, I'm telling you that I've done my maths on this thing or whatever, on the nutrient thing that I see, and that is better for you than what you know. And we know that there's so many other ways of thinking about food that is nourishing. There's, from in my background, there's Ayurvedic practice that tells you what is good for your body. And it often looks at bodies in different ways. It doesn't actually have a one size fits all, which you often see in the wellness and nutrition industry. It's like everyone needs to eat this one thing. It's like, that's actually not how it works. We all have a sense. I think we all have a deep sense of what actually makes us feel good when we eat it, whether it's what comes from the ground or, or how we eat it, whether we're sharing it with people as well. And I think that the colonial ways of wellness, nutrition industry are trying to force us to unlearn that. And so we have to do a really big job to kind of stay connected to it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Because seeing how the wellness industry markets, like often steals, like you mentioned with the turmeric, steals cultural things, labels it as a superfood, and then it becomes part of this whole like attempts to strip it of culture, and then under capitalism do that. And also speaking to that, how that more widely sits on. I had a friend call it the Woo to Q pipeline, the like wellness, alternative or complementary health to like often very hyper conservative pipeline, and the weird way in which appearing well or often in food appearing as a medicine in very colonial spaces can often radicalize people as well into this kind of weird space. Sorry, this is something I'm super excited about, so I'm not particularly eloquent because I'm just very happy to hear your thoughts on it.
I just want to jump in because here at Permaculture we support Indigenous rights and we also support Indigenous wrongs, and we've made a tech mistake, and I don't think there's a way that we could interface with the group here. So I'm just calling myself out for that. We will fix what that looks like. So please, people, if you can put questions and responses and your context into the Q&A, even if you don't have a question, if you can describe what your relationship is to food, if it's a co-op or if it's that you just grow or it's that you just eat, a few times a day, whatever that is, chuck it in and we can sort of weave you into those discussions. And then the second Indigenous wrong transparency I want to go through is we thought we could share the feedback mechanism, and we've had issues with that. So apologies about it. We will fix that and figure out a way for that to happen tomorrow. Sitting in the wrong. That's all part of this. But I did have a question moving forward from that, Deepa, around, what is the use and function of movements like permaculture as we're looking towards the relocalization of food from the vantage point that you have navigating the food system. Can you sort of paint a little bit of a picture about what sort of place they occupy and what dreams we have moving forward for these, just to sort of imagine and locate these, within that narrative. I'm gonna stop talking.
Um, I think I can answer that question. I, to me, permaculture and similar movements to permaculture are about solutions that are completely or can or should be completely separate from the current economic paradigm. I think that many of the solutions that I see that are getting generated or talked about or getting upheld in food are largely because we can't dream past the current extractive capitalist system that we're in. And so we're trying to create solutions within that. Um, as an example, when we talk about there's been in the last couple of years so much anger about the supermarkets, right? Like so many people have been talking about it, people post about it on social media, blah, 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 blah. But then like what do you actually see? You see maybe, the supermarkets are going to have to report better on when they're like putting discounts in the catalogs or something and create some sort of transparency. And then this week, I don't know if you saw it, but Albanese invited like a really big Saudi-based supermarket to open up here to compete with Coles and Woolworths. So we'll have a triopoly, not a duopoly. Like, is that really what we want? And so to me, the antithesis of that is the permaculture movement. It's creating solutions that are actually genuinely like created in justice and in health and in nourishment and regeneration. And so that's where I see it. That's what we need. We're just going to keep kind of going in these loops of trying to solve within this economic paradigm. And then the supermarkets are going to keep cheering and the corporatized food system is going to keep cheering because we're not actually creating anything new unless we move towards or center theories and movements like permaculture and truly localize food systems.
Yeah, I agree, and I think one interesting tension and benefit to, the permaculture movement is I think, the structural challenges of colonialism that exist within our larger food system, exist in the minds of permaculture practitioners, but the systems themselves are way more adaptive and way more malleable, and I think that's our opportunity as a movement to recognize, okay, how do we go through that internal decolonization process and then design localized systems. As you spoke before, there are so many multicultural communities and migrant communities and refugee communities that come with really incredible knowledge and cultural experience of foodways that don't get access to land, that don't get access to practice those. And the diversity of this knowledge that is, transcends the monoculture of whiteness does not get integrated. And so we just, and I think I remember them talking about the irrigation techniques out in Mildura and how I can't remember what her name was, who had come over from Congo and was just talking about how bizarre the irrigation techniques are here, but you have to do it because that's the structural investment of our food system here. And so we just have these bizarre ways of doing because it's what they've always done and it's what the, systems invest into. So I think, I think there definitely is possibility. Just reflecting on some of the things that were shared in an earlier session from Jessica, she spoke about food sovereignty, how food is exchanged in reciprocity, not necessarily in brokered through capitalism or colonialism or finance, economics. You speak about the value of food and what's beyond, just the cash that is handed over or the phone that does the beeping when you pay for it at the checkout. Can you speak a little bit to what that value is and how it goes beyond that? Massive question, but interested. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think with food, the complexity is the tentacles that you could follow with what you eat, and sometimes that's really terrifying as well. That you don't we're so disconnected from the way that our food is grown and where we purchase it from, and that's been an intentional choice to separate us from that by the supermarkets and others. That it is really, really hard to know where the value is, where we're adding value, but where we're extracting value as well. And that's kind of scary. But I do think that the value of food, if we see it for what it truly is, if we were to take on, principles of food sovereignty and food justice in our work, we would be seeing that food is adding nourishment to communities, and yes, nutrition, yes, you'd have less kind of burden on the healthcare system because people would be able to eat healthier, but you'd also have greater social connection and belonging. If our neighborhoods actually started to look like, and our communities started to look like, a representation of what communities actually want to eat, and if that money actually circulated within the community itself, there's, in many places, you have things like co-ops and all of these community wealth building models where food can actually be utilized, can be sold and utilized in that way, so that it can actually stay within communities. Then we have this multiplier effect of benefit for our society. And then, of course, the big issue of our food system, our current food system having such a big negative impact on our environment and our ecology is we haven't really figured out how to deal with that. And it's potentially going to keep getting worse as we move towards a greater reliance on ultra processed food and packaged food and food that has to travel from quite far away. And so if we address that, then we can address climate change. And I think it is really interesting. And I know that, Guy, for you being in the space of like the climate action as well, like food has always often sat in the margins of that action, like energy and other things have taken the forefront. And I'm seeing that shift slightly. My nervousness in my stomach is that, like, how do we not make it a colonial solution? As we move towards a more regenerative food system, we don't try and solve the issues in the same way that we have tried to solve some climate issues that have not actually worked and have kind of almost added to like another layer of colonization in the climate space. So I do think there's like all of these wonderful positive impacts that food can have. But I think it's about how we move forward in that and what we actually do about it.
Yeah, amazing. So I've got a question here from Danielle Wheeler. I grow some of my own food, buy a weekly box from a local regenerative farm, and spend lots of my time as a local councillor trying, mostly failing, to protect local farmland. I acknowledge the enormous provision in all of these, especially living on stolen land. How do we progress this discussion of privilege and permaculture, and how do we prevent the descending into a crunchy to alt-right transition like we saw around vaccinations and COVID? Apologies for my reading in that one.
And Guy, I feel like you're probably best to answer this, but I will. There's some, and I'll try and find the link and send it in. But there's some really great work that's been happening in the UK called Seeding Reparations, which is trying to deal with the kind of purist, kind of weird eugenics movement that actually the organic movement had stemmed from, and they're trying to address that because I think I think that we're a bit too close in proximity to these movements, and so we need to deal with that as well. But I think Guy and Toad, you both work in this space way more than I do, so I'll leave you to answer that one.
I'll pass to you, Toad.
Ooh, it's a big one, and it's the end of a very long day. I find I won't just immediately answer it. I just want to pause for a second and think that we talk about permaculture working with nature rather than against it. I also want to extend to working with human nature rather than against it. And that the only way to actually make effective change, like there's great education that comes out of diverting people from cults in this regard, and it applies really strongly about diverting people from the alt-right pipeline. And it shows that it's only through relational and community solutions, not through facts and figures, that we can actually make that. And it's about finding, and as hard and unfair and difficult as it is, uh, relating to someone who might be going down a pipeline that's seeking to erase your humanity, the often the only effective advocacy is in the relating and finding the shared values and being able to listen to them where they're at. Uh, with that whole alt-right slash conspiracy theory pipeline that we saw, people are typically drawn to conspiracy theories when they desire a sense of superiority in their life, have no immediate community, and want to have a sense of purpose in their life. So if you can find those intervention points and get those needs met in people outside of conspiracy theory or like fascism, uh, that's a good starting point.
Um, and to add to that as well, I think, I think the discussion of privilege in permaculture is important. And I think what's more important is actually the action of privilege in permaculture. And if we're going to take an ecological design approach, what would support the self-regulation of privilege in permaculture? And that's the visibility. And the reason there isn't visibility of how privilege is inequitably loaded within the permaculture movement is because we don't have marginalized voices. We don't have representation from communities that will call out that privilege because we haven't, it hasn't created a robust enough mechanism to have that cultural regulation within it. And so I think the discussion is one thing, but how we actually broker relationships with migrant communities, with First Nations communities, with refugee communities, with people that don't exist in the predominant white middle class of the permaculture movement. um if we don't have that relationship, it's not going to self-organize itself. It's just going to be an echo chamber that doesn't ever actually broker what that relationship is. And what I see is a movement that's actually culturally capable of acknowledging its privilege and then utilizing it. And we when we talk about change in so-called Australia, a lot of campaigning talks about the sleeping giant, which is the white middle class of Australia that's just sort of like apathetic generally about everything. They're just doing whatever and just situated within this installation of privilege. And if we can wake that up and mobilize that privilege, of which there is a huge amount of it, so much possibility is and transformation is possible in it. So I think, how do we open up accessible ways for meaningful diversity and representation within this movement? I'm wondering if you have anything else to say on that, Dheepa.
No, I completely agree, Guy. I think everything has to be centered around justice, isn't it? Otherwise, we're just doing things for the sake of probably like we're just contributing to a greater inequality gap. And I think I reflected a lot on that in the work that I do in food, because I can see that it's very easy to kind of move into that space.
Mm.
There's a comment that I've been given some consent to share just into this group. One of the things that came up that Fen spoke to was about the relationship with food and just the politics of food. And they say that currently I'm feeling extremely controlled by the dominant colonial culture in my relationship to food. I have to drop weight to get my BMI down rapidly so that I can access gender affirming care, top surgery ASAP before it becomes illegal. Because plastic surgeons are in such demand for top surgery that they can choose not to operate on fat bodies. I'm on a GLP inhibitor and it has removed all joy and intuition from my relationship with food. But at the moment, it's still the best thing I can do for my body. And whether we respond to that or not, I just wanted to speak those realities into the space as well around food and politics.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, Fen. That sounds awful and tough. And I know that food is often such a comforting part of people's lives. And so I'm really sorry that you're going through this. And I hope there's a path forward and I'm sorry that, you have to take these actions because of the biases within our healthcare system as well.
Thanks for acknowledging that, Toad, and thanks for responding, Deepa. We have another question here from Cassie Farwell. Deepa, I'd like to know your opinion on veganism. I have been vegetarian when then transitioned to vegan between 8-ish years, but stopped because I became unwell and struggled to digest legumes, etc. I am gluten/soy intolerant, like severely. I'm trying to transition back to veganism because it is better for the environment and animals. But do you think there's some people who aren't suitable for that diet, or is it me just not doing it right? Pass that to you, dietitian.
Um, Thank you. And I think, yeah, I just want to acknowledge that like food is so personal. You know, the reason that we eat the things that we eat, and it's like this expression that is in our bodies. And even if we want to eat certain things, our bodies sometimes just don't want to eat them, and they don't sit right with us. And so, um, I'm I'm sorry that this is so complex for you, and it isn't so straightforward for so many people. I I don't I don't have an opinion, I'm going to say, on veganism because I think it's too hard to paint a broad brush about what's best. When it comes to environmental impacts, you know, we do know that kind of eating lots of meat does have a negative impact on the climate, but also so does, you know, monocropping of certain grains and corn and soy and those sorts of things that also has a negative impact, and you know the impacts are really different. So I don't judge anyone who wants to be vegan or doesn't want to be vegan. That is so personal, and I leave that to people to kind of explore for themselves. But it does sound like you've got a lot of other things that are happening for you. So I think for me, my thing to you, Cassie, would be do what is going to nourish you, because your body needs to be nourished and your soul needs to be nourished, and that might be eating meat or eating other things. So do what you need to do, because the world is tough and it's complex and we're dealing with so many things all the time, and not being having the things that your body needs to actually give you energy to do what you need to do every day is really tough as well.
Thanks for that answer, Deepa. I have another question, because I know where you sit within Victoria and across the food system stuff there. I've got a question around treaty, and obviously we're seeing the pathway to treaty in process at the moment. And I just want to hear your thoughts on how that interfaces with food system. Obviously, we're talking about all of the stuff on stolen land, about making appropriate and sovereign food systems while it's on stolen land. So I just want to get your thoughts on that interface there.
Thank you, Guy. I'm definitely not an expert at all on anything on the treaty process, but I think I've learnt from what is coming out from First Nations leaders around food systems. And recently we had the pleasure of hosting Jacob Birch, who is an expert in native grains, in Melbourne at our office, and I would direct you to look at his Churchill Fellowship report, which is incredible, where he went to North America to learn from First Nations people about how they are kind of governing their food systems. And his insights that I've kind of been thinking about and mulling over was, we are at this tension point, I think, around foods and bush foods and certain things where we want it to have economic value, we want it to have value, and we want that value to go back to First Nations people. But there's an inherent at the moment where nature of it that it's actually not accessible to many First Nations people because of the cost, and that is not sovereignty either. So how, and the context that he explained was that in North America and these reserves and things like that, they actually had kind of full self-determination of their food system. So they were able to create a system where they could feed themselves first with their native grains, and then the rest was sold out. And I know that we don't have that. We don't have those systems in place. So my hope is that a treaty process would allow that, so that we aren't having to create these systems where First Nations people can't even access their own food. To me, I'm here to listen and learn, and just to back whatever comes out from that process. I mean, I think the Victorian traditionalist bush foods and botanicals strategy is incredible. Like, you can get really into that. It names 13 different plant species, bush food species that are ready for like that are really reliable and resilient, and that can be kind of grown quite widely. But the problem is that you don't have this kind of understanding or a way of proving that you're an Indigenous-led business. So I'm really curious to see how that can be propped up through a treaty, like what comes off of the treaty process that can really support that. And then what the conversations are around land and land back as well.
Thank you. I think echoing also back to Jessica Hutchings' talks about Hua Parakora, like the Maori food sovereignty framework, which has a certification quality to it as well, which can allow, because yeah, I think as you meant before, First Nations representation in bush foods went down from 2 to 1% recently. Like it's actually the divide is worsening. And you touched, I'm aware we have just a little bit of time left. And I just have a small question before we thank you. And it's maybe not a so small question, but you also mentioned the big thing about food and cost as well, which is a huge thing. Because typically, like regenerative foods and these kinds of things are wildly kind of like we think of organic bougie farmers markets when we think of regenerative and ethical foods. But obviously, that isn't really accessible. Can you speak somewhat to that?
Yes. Basically, in our current system, there's no way for a person who is on not a high income or even on a middle or low income to access to regenerative food. That's just like it's not financially possible on people's household budgets. And we have gotten trapped in a system that instead of trying to deal with that, and instead of trying to look at models that will allow people who are farming to get their what they deserve in terms of their labor costs, to ensure that there's no kind of exploitation along the supply chain, and how those communities can actually, the low income communities can actually buy food within their budgets, because we haven't done any of that in the Australian setting. And that could look like, things like universal basic income as a way to address that. But that has not been on the radar in the Australian context. And what we have seen is this failure demand model that's been created that is our reliance on the food relief organizations. Yes, emergency food relief is needed in times of emergencies, but it's become a solution to address chronic, like it's just being used constantly now. And especially in the Victorian context, the government has funneled millions of dollars into 3-4 food relief agencies, which I find incredibly problematic, because a lot of that money is not going back to the producers at all. It's about the supermarkets covering themselves for the food waste that they've created and the way that they buy food. I am interested in understanding and exploring how we find a way for communities to be able to access regenerative food. There are organizations that are doing this or trying to figure this out in the Melbourne context, for example, the Community Grocer, but also if you look at like what we talked about, Food Next Door in Mildura or United African Farm, who are growing with kind of regenerative principles. They may not call it regenerative or they may not call it permaculture, but the way that they grew food back home was really, really in tune with nature. So I think that the problem is that often these organizations are working against the system, a system that is trying to essentially break them, a corporatized food system. And so how do we actually value that? Is it from government policy? Is it from philanthropy? I have no idea. But how do we actually meaningfully financially support these organizations, these leaders that are working within it, so they're not at a point of burnout and bankruptcy constantly and trying to they're providing a social public good, and they need to be supported to do that. And we haven't quite landed that in our context, I don't believe.
Thank you for answering a question that almost doesn't have an answer at this point.
Yeah.
Sorry for throwing you that curveball right at the last 5 minutes. Thank you.
I do believe we did start 5 minutes late, so we get to finish 5 minutes later as well. So we've got I'm just going to look through the questions here. Thank you all for taking the conversation where it went today. Much appreciated from Erin. Thank you, Erin. Incredible evening of powerful ideas for change. Thank you so much. Thank you for Christine. Yeah. I guess one of the things that Jessica also said, quoting the late Moana Jackson, a really, really incredible Māori leader, um, was we need to act as if. Um, and that was a leading whakaaro, a leading philosophy about how we create the change that we need to have. And so I want to pose to you, you spoke about we're currently operating within the current system. Can you expand or give us some dreams or some perspectives on what does it mean to act as if in this context? And what are some of the lenses that you take when thinking about your food system work, acting as if?
Mm, love that. For me, it's as if access and enjoyment of nourishing food was just a right that everyone had. It wasn't a privilege that everyone got to have this, that you could walk down a street in Melbourne and you'd have a grocer that's a cultural grocer that's owned by someone who's in your community. They know your name, they know who you are, everyone kind of is able to share around that. There's places for people to grow food, to be able to, gardens and community gardens are just a thing that exists that people are supported with. And that we had this really nice reciprocal relationship as people that live in the city with the people who are in the regions that are growing our food. That currently we have this extractive nature we take from them and we put a burden on them to grow our food without actually giving them much back. And I just would love for us to have this way of buying food and this support that we have, that we're all kind of connected and working together for a better food system rather than feeling like we need to kind of advocate or push our own agenda or what we need in the cities. I would love for First Nations food to be part of our culture, but for it to be led by Indigenous wisdom and Indigenous leaders and First Nations leaders. And I wish that we would just have, I guess, in the Melbourne context, like if we actually just talked about our food culture in a way that was less bougie as well. Like I really hate this. Like I've been using the word foodie city in a lot of my work in Melbourne, but using it as a way to kind of like interrogate what we actually mean by that. It's like, oh, it's a foodie city for some people. It's a foodie city. We could go to exclusive restaurants, but like, what does it actually mean to have a beautiful food culture that is like shared and nourishing, rather than one that only some people get to access? And so I'd love to kind of interrogate that idea that everyone is a foodie because everyone just eats and enjoys food, not in an exclusive way.
As if. Yes, let's do that. That is what we want. Let's call that in. Let's absolutely call that in.
Thank you.
Todd.
Oh, thank you. I was just going to say that absolutely cracked my heart open, that last thing about like, it's only a foodie city if, and what does it mean to make a foodie city for everyone? That really just, yeah. Deep gratitude for you and the work that you do and the space that you occupy as an incredible food systems weaver, advocate, leader. I get to hear vicariously through Guy all the incredible things that you get to do together. And I'm so grateful that you gave up an afternoon to come talk to us about the incredible work you do. Thank you so much, Deepa.
Thank you so much, Toad. And thank you so much, guys. A pleasure. And we're lucky to have people like you and Permaculture in the space and in the system, because these spaces are so rare and they're so needed.
Back at you. And everyone's got a waita at the end of this, so to you. Nau mai ko te mauriti, ko te mauri noho, ko te mauri o rangi, ko te mauri o papa, ko te mauri aroha, ko te ai o. Ko te maringo, ko te mauri o te reo, Māori. Tūturu whiti whakamaua kia tina. Haumie, huie, taike. Deepa, thank you so much for spending your time with us. Thank you so much for all of the threads. I feel like you're this amazing, bird that flies across the food system, picking up seeds over here and dropping them over here, and you're like, hey, I saw this over here, and it's just such a joy to to be in collaboration with you. So thank you so much for coming along. To all of our attendees for day one, thank you so much for sitting with us through this and experiencing this all together. A huge thanks to everybody. And I'll pass to you, Toad, if you want to close us off.
Thank you, Guy. So yeah, this was day one of 3 days. So today we were having that perspective of saprotrophic mushrooms, which is the decomposing, it's the like critiquing. And we have this talk about queering of critiquing or interrogating social norms, but then we kind of move into the next bit of queering, which is the building of new relationships and systems to meet the needs of all. So the next session, we're going to be having under the umbrella of parasitic mushrooms or divesting power. Parasites get a really bad rap, but are incredibly important ecological powerhouses that limit systems. We talk about, the economy talks about infinite growth. The only thing that grows infinitely in nature is cancer, and parasites are an incredible limiting factor to limit exponential growth. And we're going to be having a bit of that perspective and bringing some of that magic in with us. So thank you, everyone. It's been a great session. Thank you, Deepa. Thank you, Russia. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Guy. And we will see. Thank you. And we will see you all on Saturday or a Sunday or into the future in the recordings. Thank you, everyone.
See you later, everybody.